Hey there, welcome. So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning how to write the introduction for our IELTS essays. Now, broadly speaking, our introduction should do two things. First of all, it should introduce the topic. Now, this will be between 1 and 2 sentences long. And then after that, we're going to respond to the question. And that's also 1 to 2 sentences. Let's have a look at an example. Imagine you do the IELTS writing test and you get this question. Teenagers should have regular exams at secondary school as this will prepare them better for life after leaving school. To what extent do you agree or disagree? Now, the first thing that you're going to do is to underline the keywords that help you to understand the question. So words like teenagers, regular exams, prepare them better for life after leaving school. Okay, now when it comes to writing our introduction, the first thing we're going to do is introduce the topic. Now for that, we're going to use the rubric, so this section here. And what we're going to do is paraphrase this in our own words. Let's have a look. Exams are an important feature of secondary education. However, there is contention over whether frequent exams prepare students for post-school life. Okay, now you'll see that we've used different words than those words that appear in the rubric. So for example, it says teenagers should have regular exams in the rubric, whereas in our introduction we have frequent exams. In the rubric, so the rubric is the statement of the question, we have secondary school. In our introduction, we have secondary education, so a slight change. We have life after leaving school. In our introduction, we have post-school life. So the idea is when we're introducing the topic, we're paraphrasing the statement, we're paraphrasing the rubric, and we're trying to use synonyms instead of using the same words that appear in the statement. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is respond to the question. And this is also going to be 1 to 2 sentences long. And when we do this, we answer this part. To what extent do you agree or disagree? So it's going to look something like this. In this essay, I will argue that teenagers should be given regular exams at secondary school as this will help them to be prepared for their academic and professional life after they have left school. Okay, now when we're responding to the question, we need to be very, very careful that we're showing the examiner that we fully understand the question that's been asked. Because of that, I advise you not to use synonyms unless you're 100% sure. So when we're introducing the topic, yes, we paraphrase and we use synonyms. When we're responding to the question, we only use synonyms if we're 100% sure. So for example, in the rubric, in the statement, it will say teenagers, and we write teenagers. In the rubric, it will say secondary school, and we write secondary school. In the rubric, it says life after leaving school, and we just change it slightly to after they have left school. Now we do this because we want to show the examiner that we fully understand the question. So yes, use synonyms and paraphrasing when we're introducing the topic, but when we're responding to the question, you need to be very sure that you're showing the examiner that you understand the exact question that you're being asked. As a result, don't use synonyms unless you're 100% sure. Okay, now what we're going to do is look at the introducing the topic and responding to the question in a little more detail. First of all, introducing the topic. Now, there are different ways to introduce the topic. One of the most useful ways to introduce the topic is to contrast times. And I'll show you what I mean. Imagine you get this question. Research shows that business meetings and business training are increasingly taking place online. Do the advantages of this development outweigh the disadvantages? Okay, we could write something like this. In the past, business meetings and training seminars were usually held in person on the company premises. Nowadays, they are frequently being held online. Okay, so we have a structure to this introduction. We have in the past, comma, verb phrase, nowadays, comma, verb phrase. And we can use this as a template for a lot of IELTS introductions, particularly those that questions that talk about something that was different in the past and, was one way in the past and is different now in the present. So we call this a development. And you can usually tell because they'll say this development in the question. Okay, I'll show you another example. In many countries, parents are deciding to have children later in their lives. Do you think the advantages of this development outweigh the disadvantages? Okay, did you spot? Again, we have this development. So we can use our template introduction structure. In the past, it was common for couples to settle down and have children in their early 20s. Nowadays, many couples are waiting until their 30s to start a family. Okay, so again, we have in the past, a verb phrase, nowadays, a verb phrase. And we can tell that because we have this development, so we're talking about a development in the question. Let's have a look at a third example. Nowadays, it is becoming increasingly common for people to do their work from home rather than going into their place of work. What are the reasons for this? Is this a positive or negative development? Okay, so we've spotted the word development. Let's use our introduction structure. In the past, the majority of work was carried out in offices or on the company premises. Nowadays, more and more people are switching to working from home. Okay, so when we have a development in the question that we're being asked, we can use this template structure. Another useful template is when we introduce contrasting opinions. And I'll show you an example. Some people believe that individuals should be allowed to own a gun as a means to protect themselves and their families. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Okay, let's write our introduction. Some people feel that the possession of firearms should be legalized on the grounds that they are necessary for personal protection and maintaining the safety of their families. Others argue that widespread possession of guns will lead to a more dangerous society. Okay, so now we have a new structure. We have some or many people feel, believe, think that, and then a verb phrase, and then a new sentence that says others argue that, and then a verb phrase. Okay, and we're going to use this template structure when we have phrases like some people. So the question clearly shows that there's a difference in opinions. So when there's a difference in situations between times, then we can use the in the past and then nowadays structure. When we have different opinions, we have the some people feel that and others argue that structure. Let's have a look at another example. Some people believe that people should be required to retire from their career at a particular age. Others believe that people should be allowed to work as long as they like. Discuss both these views and give your opinion. Okay, again we have some people, so the question is showing us that there's a debate in opinions. Let's use our template. Some people think that there should be a mandatory retirement age. Others argue that there should be no limits to how long a person is allowed to work. Okay, so a contrasting opinion way to introduce the topic is very useful for IELTS essays. Now, we also have certain grammatical structures that we use when we respond to the question. Okay, let's take our model question again. So teenagers should have regular exams at secondary school as this will prepare them better for life after leaving school. To what extent do you agree or disagree? Now, When we talk about general statements and facts, we use the present simple. Let me show you. Exams are an important feature of secondary school education. So this is a general statement and we're using the present simple. We're saying exams are an important feature of secondary school education. Another example. Teachers monitor exam results to understand their students' progress. Okay, so teachers monitor. Monitor is in the present simple. However, if we want to talk about recent or unfinished changes, we're going to use the present perfect. Recently, many parents have begun to question whether their children are under too much stress. Okay, so the word recently identifies that we're talking about a recent change. As a result, we're going to use the present perfect. Recently, many parents have begun to question whether their children are under too much stress. Over the last decade, exams have become much more prevalent in high schools. Okay, so over the last decade is a time period that has not finished. We're saying from the last decade until now, so we're talking about a development that is still ongoing, and as a result, we're going to use the present perfect. Exams have become much more prevalent. Okay, if you're wondering decade, so over the last decade, decade means 10 years. A very useful word for IELTS essays. Okay, we have another grammatical tense that we use regularly when we introduce the topic, and that is the present continuous. We use it when we want to talk about things which are changing right now. The stress that young people are put under in high school is constantly rising. So we're saying that it is constantly rising, it's constantly changing. So we're going to use the present continuous. Parents are becoming increasingly worried that their children are under too much pressure. Okay, so we've looked at some templates, we've looked at some grammar for introducing the topic. Now let's look at how we can respond to the question. Okay, now we said that this should be 1 to 2 sentences long, and it should also show the examiner that we have clearly understood the question, and as a result, we only use synonyms if we are 100% sure. So yes, use synonyms when we're introducing the topic, but when it comes to responding to the question, we only use synonyms when we are 100% sure. And that's because the examiner is looking at this part of your introduction to see whether you have understood the question. Now, also, when we respond to the question, we introduce the ideas that appear in our body paragraphs. So this is sometimes called a thesis statement. And we'll look at some examples in a second. Okay, let's first look at the importance of using the right synonym. Imagine we get our model question again, and we write this introduction. In this essay, I will argue that children should be given regular exams at secondary school. Okay, have a look at the word children and think, is this an appropriate word to use here? So the rubric says teenagers, and we have written children. Are they synonyms? Well, not necessarily. A better word would be teenagers. So just using the same word from the rubric. So don't use words like children if they're not 100% synonyms. It's better to use the word from the statement, so teenagers. Yes, we could maybe use adolescents here, because we know adolescents and teenagers are perfect synonyms. However, if you can't think of a synonym, just use the word from the rubric rather than trying to guess. Okay, now when we're writing our introduction and when we're responding to the question, we need an outline statement, or a thesis statement it's sometimes called. In this essay, I will argue that teenagers should be given regular exams at secondary school, as this will help them be prepared for their academic and professional life after they have left school. So our thesis statement tells the examiner what they're going to read about later on in the essay. So in this case, they're going to read about our idea that they are prepared for their academic and for their professional life after leaving school. And this is our structure. In this essay, comma, I will, and then we have a verb like argue, explain, present, describe, that kind of thing. Okay, now when we're writing our thesis statement and responding to the question, we often need to express our opinion. Now we can use phrases like I believe that or I would argue. We tend to know these phrases. However, some of the slightly more tricky phrases are the ones that partially agree with the question. Here's a useful one. Take into account. In this essay, I will argue that regular exams do prepare teenagers for life after school, but we should also take into account how those exams are carried out. Okay, so take into account, very useful. Provided. In this essay, I will argue that regular exams do prepare teenagers for life after school, provided that they are carried out in a sensible way. It depends on. In this essay, I will argue that regular exams do prepare teenagers for life after school, but realize that it depends on how those exams are carried out. So we can use phrases like take into account, provided, and it depends on to partially agree. So when we don't fully agree or fully disagree, we're partially agreeing, and we're saying why we partially agree. Okay, now what we're going to do is look at some example introductions for all of the most common essay question types. And they are the agree, disagree, the advantage, disadvantage, discussion, double question, and direct questions. Now you'll know that the most common question type that you get in IELTS essays are the agree, disagree questions. A question a bit like this. Some people believe that individuals should be allowed to own a gun as a means to protect themselves and their families. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Okay, now the first thing we do is introduce the topic. Let's say, some people feel that the possession of firearms should be legalized on the grounds that they are necessary for personal protection and maintaining the safety of their families. And then we respond to the question. I completely disagree. In this essay, I will argue that individuals should not be allowed to own a gun, as it will be difficult to regulate who has access to these weapons and may lead to a more dangerous society. So I completely agree clearly shows the examiner what your response is, what your position is, what your opinion is in relation to this question. And then the phrase that I've underlined, so it will be difficult to regulate who has access to these weapons and may lead to a more dangerous society, shows the examiner why I completely disagree. And these are the arguments that I'm going to develop in my IELTS essay. Okay, let's look at an advantage-disadvantage question. A question a bit like this. In many countries, parents are deciding to have children later in their lives. Do you think the advantages of this development outweigh the disadvantages? Okay, so we see this development, so we know we can use our in the past, nowadays template. In the past, it was common for couples to settle down and have children in their early 20s. Nowadays, many couples are waiting until their 30s to start a family. And now we respond to the question. In this essay, I will argue that having children later in life is beneficial for both the parents and the children. Okay, next question. A discussion question. Some people believe that people should be required to retire from their career at a particular age. Others believe that people should be allowed to work as long as they like. Discuss both these views and give your own opinion. Okay, so we've got the some people, so let's use our contrasting opinions template. Some people think that there should be a mandatory retirement age. Others argue that there should be no limits to how long a person is allowed to work. And now let's respond to the question. In this essay, I will argue that people should be allowed to work as long as they like so that they can continue to earn money for the future. Okay. Next we have the double question. And there's lots of different types of double questions. Here's one. Traffic congestion is a growing problem in many of the world's major cities. Explain some possible reasons for this problem and suggest some solutions. So this is a very common double question type. We've got the reasons and then solutions. So we often have problems and solutions, or causes and solutions, or reasons and solutions. Let's say this. Over the last decade, many people have shifted to choosing electric vehicles rather than petrol or diesel vehicles. However, others are discouraged from changing to electric cars because of their high price and the familiarity that they have with petrol vehicles. In this essay, I will argue that these obstacles can be overcome with an appropriate pricing model and information over the correct use of electric vehicles. Okay, there are other types of double question. Here's another type. Nowadays, it is becoming increasingly common for people to do their work from home rather than going into their place of work. What are the reasons for this? Is this a positive or negative development? Okay, quite a tricky question to get in IELTS. The first part asks what are the reasons. The second part asks, or is more similar to an advantage-disadvantage essay. They're saying, is this a positive or a negative development? Let's say this. In the past, the majority of work was carried out in offices or on the company premises. Nowadays, more and more people are switching to working from home. The development has been compounded by two factors: the advance in technology that has made it possible, and the COVID pandemic, which has made it essential. Let's respond to the question. In this essay, I will explain that this is a positive development because it allows people to save time commuting and has also been beneficial for the environment. So, a more difficult question requiring a slightly longer introduction. Okay, finally we have the last question type, which is not so common in IELTS and tends to be slightly easier to write the introduction for. It's the direct question. Research into new types of medicine is essential to improve health and deal with disease. Who do you think should fund this research? Private companies, individuals, or governments? Okay, let's introduce the topic. Researching new types of medicine is integral to humankind. However, it can also be extremely expensive. And now let's respond to the question. In this essay, I will argue that governments should fund this research due to the costly nature of research and in order to ensure that any new medicine can be cheaply supplied to those most in need. Right, there it is. So remember, when we write our introductions, we need to introduce the topic and respond to the question. Okay, best of luck with your studies and your preparation for the IELTS writing test, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Happy studying. Bye then.